Hey, so I've spent the last, I don't know, probably 3 weeks going here, there, and everywhere. I spent a week at summer camp with my son, and then we turned around, went to Costa Rica for 8 days. And then Holly and I went to a Christian coaches sales conference in Milwaukee this past week. I don't even know how many days I've spent in my own bed in the last 3 weeks. Today's episode is about that middle trip that we took. You see, you can spend a lot of money, you can plan a beautiful trip, you can give a family incredible experiences, and you can still find yourself, in the middle of the moments thinking, "Oof, this is not how I thought this was going to go." Hi, I'm Dan Hayden, and this is the Positive Legacy podcast for Christian fathers. Like I said, today I want to talk to you about our recent trip to Costa Rica. And no, this is not going to be a travel recap. I'm not a video blogger with a bunch of videos on the La Fortuna waterfalls, right? I'm definitely not going to give you any sort of packing tips or give you advice on Airbnbs, and you'll hear why later. Um, but I want to talk to you about, is what vacations can really reveal. Because if you're a dad, and if you're listening to this, I hope you are, you probably know this already. Vacations, they carry a lot of weight. You put a lot of time and effort in planning them, and you want them to be memorable. You want your kids to experience something beautiful, and you want to provide moments that they talk about for years. And that's all well and good. We all want that. I want that too. And I wanted that for this trip as well. But what I want you to hear right up front is this: your vacations are not going to be perfect. If you haven't figured that out yet, I trust you. I mean, I promise you, not everything's going to go the way you want it to go. Something will always go sideways. Somebody, always, most of you, always, you're going to get tired. Somebody will be disappointed with some part of the trip. And everything, I promise, everything is going to cost more than you thought it would. Some things are going to smell weird, and or break or flood, as you're going to hear later. And sometimes things are just going to take longer than you expected. And all of that is okay, right? What matters most is not whether the trip is perfect. What matters most is who you become when it isn't perfect. If I had to describe our trip to Costa Rica in one word, I'll use this word: mercurial. Very up and down. There were incredible highs, like ziplining as a family over rainforest canopy. We took a night walk, with a guide who I mean, he picked sloths out of trees that we couldn't even have imagined. We saw a baby sloth, being carried by its mom. We saw, frogs glowing at night. We saw ants that could put you in a hospital. I'd rather not see those again. We had a beautiful afternoon in a hot springs resort. We spent a lot of time on the road driving through beautiful Costa Rican countryside and seeing the landscape, experiencing the culture and eating the food, which, by the way, there's a local dish called casada. I highly recommend it. If you go to Costa Rica and just stick to like burgers and nachos, like some of my kids did, you're missing out. But, there were also moments where I just looked around and I thought, this is incredible. I can't believe we're here. I'm so grateful. We get to do this together as a family. But there were also some real lows. Late night drives to our first Airbnb that required, at a minimum, at least 45 minutes on unpaved, rough, foggy, and unlit roads. Needless to say, Holly is going to double check my math the next time I book Airbnbs. There was one night in a really sort of cramped, hot, poorly plumbed, we'll get into that later, a poorly plumbed villa where everybody was just overtired and the toilet flooded and we had to move rooms late at night. And then, honestly, one of the scariest moments of the whole trip happened the first night that we were at the beach. You see, we spent half the trip sort of inland, right, in the La Fortuna Lake Arenal region, and then we moved out to the Pacific coast. I heard a man screaming and crying for help in the water. And, I'm not a particularly strong swimmer, but I ran in there to try to help. I just sort of looked around and I was like, somebody's got to help this guy. But the problem was, I started to sort of feel myself slowly being pulled out. And I look, and then I can hear my wife and kids just screaming for me to come back in. And I looked around, I said, wow, that I've never experienced a current like that before. I did eventually make it back in with some help, but it was pretty scary for everybody involved. One woman just kept telling my kids what a hero I was because I tried to help. No joke. In the end, she was actually the one who ended up helping, get that other guy in. My whole family was pretty shook after that, and honestly, so was I. So, what do you do with a trip with all of that? What do you do with a trip that has all those highs and all those lows? What do you do when your dream family experience contains both ziplining and panic and sloths and sewage and both beauty and exhaustion? And I think that's where the real episode is, because vacations, they do not remove your family dynamics; they reveal them. They reveal what stress looks like in your home. They reveal how everybody handles disappointment. Excuse me. They reveal what happens when expectations collide with reality. And they reveal whether dad, can stay in sage and remain calm and steady when the whole thing gets super messy and out of sync. And that's the real topic today. And if you're thinking, yeah, trips, holidays, sports weekends, or even regular Saturdays, they just tend to reveal the worst in me. That is exactly the kind of thing I help dad work on, with my coaching. Not because you're failing, but because pressure always tells the truth. It shows you where your growth needs to happen. One of the things I expected going into the trip was just normal travel stress. Getting the kids through airport and customs, right? Tight quarters, spending a lot of time in close proximity to one another. Long days, even though we were very deliberate in not planning, packing our days with stuff. And like I said, being around each other constantly. All of that stress that came with that stuff, and that part didn't surprise me. What surprised me more was the stress associated with things like humidity, something we don't typically have a lot of here in Southern California. Some of the living conditions that we found ourselves in, just basic logistics at times. I wasn't expecting, how low water pressure, in our showers and not being able to flush toilet paper would really start wearing on people. And, to be honest, some of the beds in the Airbnb weren't the most comfortable things in the world. I wasn't expecting how tricky it would feel at times to find just places to eat that we could all agree on. I wasn't expecting how much rough roads and darkness and long drives would test everybody's emotional bandwidth. And that's part of what family travel does. It takes ordinary discomfort and removes your family buffers, your familiar buffers. At home, I mean, if you're annoyed, you've got your chair, your fridge, your bedroom, your routine. We've got air conditioning throughout. We've got our known places. But on a trip, especially a trip with some adventure built into it, and we were deliberate in that. That's what we wanted. You don't have those same stabilizers. So what's inside everybody just starts coming out a little faster. And I saw that in me too. The saboteurs that showed up most clearly for me were the judge, the victim, and the pleaser. And, when it came time to eat, sometimes the controller. But that's also where the judge showed up, especially around food. Anytime we'd order a lot of food, or, and one of the kids would just be disappointed with what their meal looked like, right? Tacos in Costa Rica at some certain restaurants don't look like tacos here in SoCal, for example. They would be disappointed or just barely touch it. And I could just feel my judge getting loud fast. You spend money, you try to make it work. You're hungry yourself. Everybody's tired. And then suddenly, a routine meal becomes just a referendum on gratitude or waste or fairness. That is not really about the food, is it? That is stress just looking for somewhere to land. The victim showed up in some of those difficult travel moments too. Those long drives, they really wore me down. Rough roads, hot rooms, plumbing issues, like I talked about. All the little internal narratives that say, why is this so hard? Why can't this just be easier? And the pleaser showed up in wanting everybody to have a good time, because that's one of the hidden pressures of family vacations, especially for us dads. You're not just taking a trip, you're carrying this quiet hope that everyone will feel happy, grateful, connected, and impressed by what you were able to pull off. When that doesn't happen on cue, it can stir up a lot. This is actually one of the places where I think mental fitness matters so much. Not because it makes hard trips easy, but because it helps you notice what story you're starting to tell. I say it all the time with my clients. Life is not all rainbows and butterflies, right? But do you want to react, or how do you want to respond? And that's what mental fitness helps with. So if you're the kind of dad who can feel some of that in your own life, especially the pressure to make family experiences meaningful and smooth, that's exactly the kind of thing that I help fathers, slow down with my coaching. Because often the trip itself is not the biggest issue. It's the meaning that we attach to all the mess. Now, I do want to say this clearly. I was really proud of how I showed up overall, and the rest of my family did it too. There were no really big blowups, no slam doors, nothing even close to that. I really feel like I was able to maintain, sage mindset throughout the whole thing. Not perfectly in every internal moment, of course, but externally, relationally, and as a father and a husband, I think, and even looking back, I think I stayed remarkably steady. And that matters to me because I know a previous version of me, that would not have done that. A previous version of me would have brought more intensity into those car rides, more frustration into food conversations. I'm paying for it. More visible agitation into late night problems. Telling you, those car rides were not easy. Instead, I found myself often looking for the gifts and the opportunities in these moments. That's what I want dads to hear from this episode. You do not need a perfect vacation, but you do need a calm and steady, a sage perspective. Because the minute something goes wrong, your family is going to start taking cues. They're going to start watching your face, your tone, your pace, your interpretation of what's happening. If dad acts like this is a disaster, it becomes a disaster. If dad acts like this is just inconvenient but totally workable, hopefully the whole family has a chance to follow you there. I saw that most clearly in some of the drives. Those roads into the mountains, they were no joke. Rough, foggy, narrow. We almost got, collided head on with a tourist bus or a bread truck at times. They were unlit, poorly lit at best, and they were long. Some of them felt like they were just going to keep going on forever. And in those moments, I think I was just probably, at my best as a calm and steady dad. Not because I loved it. I didn't. I was pretty tight. I was pretty tense, but I just kept reminding the kids, this is going to make for some great stories, because in those moments, the family needed somebody to stay anchored. And sometimes that's what fatherhood is. Not necessarily being the loudest voice, not fixing everything immediately, just staying anchored long enough that everyone else can borrow your steadiness. If you hear that and you think, hey, that's what I want. I want to be the kind of dad whose steadiness my family can borrow. Again, that's the work I do, helping you become calmer under pressure. And that's not abstract work. It does show up in car rides and vacations, on the sidelines, or in your kitchen. There was a beautiful moment where I saw our family culture just show up in a really positive way on this trip. The ziplining was awesome. Everybody was nervous, and yet they were all encouraging each other. The girls weren't looking down on Billy, kind of sneering like, oh, treating him like he was a little kid. All of that stood out to me. Nobody was mocking, nobody was withdrawing, nobody was sort of spiraling. They were all just helping each other through those fears and anxieties. Because look, zipping along on a cable for 580 yards or whatever, hundreds of feet above canopy, it's got to be, stressful for a 10-year-old. And the way that we responded and came together as a family, that was a big deal, because that kind of moment tells you something about, who your family is becoming. Encouragement under pressure is not an accident. That's culture. That's one of the reasons I care so much about all this work. Not because I want dads to become robotic or emotionally flat, but because your mindset becomes contagious, and so does your family culture. Now, if I had to point to the moment where things really sort of broke down, is definitely that night in the villa. And I want to share some of what's important there is how we ended up in that villa in the first place. We had to make an adjustment. We left that first Airbnb a night early because we just did not want to drive those rutted, pitted, unlit roads again at night. That felt like a wise decision. Hey, let's just eat the cost and get a night, closer to town, for tomorrow night. It was a protective decision and a family-centered decision. In other words, we we made a good call, and it still went badly. And that matters because a lot of dads carry this belief that if I make the right decision, things should work out. And when they don't, we start second guessing ourselves, blaming ourselves, or assuming we got it wrong. But sometimes you make a wise adjustment and still get a painful outcome. That does not mean the adjustment was foolish. It means fatherhood does not come with guaranteed outcomes. So we made what I still think was a good decision, the decision to leave the Airbnb a night early and get a room or some lodging accommodations, closer to La Fortuna. And we ended up, in a tighter, hotter, and frankly, poorly plumbed place. I had gone out to get some more bottled water because, by and large, I drank the tap water there, but this place, I just didn't trust it. So I told, hey, I'm going to go out and get some bottled water real quick. No big deal. I wasn't trying to escape, stress or heat or anything like that. Anyway. And when I got back, one of my daughters, she was just outside crying. I think the moments had just gotten to her, the heat, the stress, the exhaustion, the fatigue, right? And my wife was just, I walk in and I'm like, sweetheart, what's going on? And my wife is frantically packing. And I look and the toilet had flooded. Everybody was exhausted and they were hot and they were just done with it all. And now it's around 9:45 at night. We either had to move rooms or just find a whole new place to stay. And that was probably the low point at the trip for me mentally and emotionally. Just looking around and blaming myself. I didn't internally. I was a mess. Externally, my kids saw me just sort of, okay, hey, and take it all in stride. We moved to another room. We got set up again. But internally, I was a wreck. I blamed myself for the entire thing. I looked at every decision I had made for that trip and internalized it as the wrong decision. And I remember even telling Holly, I'm never doing this again. The next trip we have, I can't make these decisions because every decision I make is wrong. And she just kind of looked at me like, come on, bro. So, but I think what it made it so intense, at the time too, was that everybody's reserves were just gone. That's another thing I'd want dads to remember is the same problem hits differently when everybody's depleted. A plumbing issue at 2 in the afternoon is one thing, but a plumbing issue late at night when everybody's trying to get settled in the heat and the humidity after a long day in a cramped room, when everybody is just already hanging on by a thread, that's differently. It hits differently in those moments. It's not just the event; it's the capacity that we have in reserve to handle those events. That's why your emotional steadiness matters so much. Again, externally, I was pretty calm and collected, and kids got into bed pretty. Internally, I was pretty wrecked. But remember, you don't need to be superhuman. But because when everybody else is running low, your presence becomes even more important. And I also think there's a hidden lesson, excuse me, in that villa night. Your kids need to see that a good decision can still lead to a hard outcome, and that this does not mean we panic or collapse or start attacking each other. This is just real life. You make the best decision you can with what you know, and sometimes it still gets messy. That doesn't make you a bad father. It makes you a father living in a real world, in this world. And if that line alone hits you in the chest and said, yeah, I made the best decision I could, it still got messy. That's worth paying attention to. A lot of dads are carrying shame over outcomes that, were never fully in their control. And that's something I'd love to help you work through. And if I'm honest, one area where we probably do not do as well as we could have is repair. There were not many explicit repair moments on this trip. That's something I sort of noticed after the fact. The one that stands out most, though, involved that beach rescue that I talked about at the beginning of this episode. After I came back in from the water, Holly had a really hard time just sort of understanding why I ran in, given that, like I said, I'm not a particularly strong swimmer. Everything between us after that moment that was not tense, but it was just very, very quiet. I could tell the kids were shook up too, but eventually, after we had put the kids to bed and said goodnight and just sort of sat up, reading like we normally do, she just sort of put her book down and she asked me, she's like, "Hey, what was going on in your head when you ran in the water like that?" And I could tell she was. I mean, look, she she could have seen me, like she could have seen her husband just swept out to sea, right? I mean, that's that's no small thing. I just told her the truth. I said, "Look, all I could think of was like, hey, somebody needs to help that guy." And I looked around, and one lady started running in the water. The lady who told me I was a hero afterwards, and I'm like, "All right, I gotta help." You know, um, and I just can't stand there and watch this guy just drift away, right? I'm still not sure that she fully understood, but at least she had an answer. And I think that matters too. Sometimes repair is not a neat bow. Sometimes it's simply giving the truth of your inner world to the person who's trying to make sense of what just happened. Not every hard moment gets fully resolved on the spot, but honesty still matters. One of the more interesting things that Trip revealed about our family is that we actually have greater patience for each other in a setting like that than we often do at home. And that really stood out to me. I mean, yeah, there was still some nitpicking here and there, but not like we used to. At home, familiarity can make us maybe a little less gracious and a little more judgmental of each other. We're quicker, we're sharper, we're more impatient with the ordinary. But on a trip like this, where everybody knows things are a little uncertain, we seem to extend more grace. And that's worth paying attention to because it makes me ask, why are we sometimes more patient with each other in a foreign country than in our own kitchen? And that's a good question for any family. Maybe that's one of the hidden gifts of a trip like this. It exposes not only where stress lives, but where grace is actually more available than we thought. If you're listening and you've got a family trip coming up, or you're in the middle of one, or maybe just coming off one that didn't go like you hoped, I want to offer you a few things to hold on to. First, don't measure the trip by how flawlessly it went. Measure it by how your family met what happened. Second, expect your saboteurs, those negative thought patterns. Expect them to show up. Travel, money, discomfort, food, exhaustion, and uncertainty. That is fertile ground for your saboteurs. So don't be shocked when you're judge or your victim or pleaser or controller or avoider starts making noise. To be honest with you, I overcame my avoider to make that decision to go to the villa that night. And it still didn't work out, right? But hey, just notice them. And third, remember that a good decision can still lead to a hard outcome. Don't judge every decision only by how it turned out. Sometimes the wiser move still lands you in a flooded, villa. Sometimes the protective adjustment still creates a new problem, and sometimes the road you were trying to avoid gives way to um, a room you never would have chosen. That's life. So don't pile self condemnation on top of difficulty. And fourth, keep looking for the gifts and the opportunities in those circumstances. Look, that does not mean you need to be Pollyannish and pretending that a flooded toilet was awesome, because trust me, it was not. It means asking, what is the moment asking of me as a father? Is it steadiness or humor or leadership? My goodness, always leadership. Empathy. Empathy for the kid who's crying on the front doorstep, and you're like, I just went for bottled water. What is going on here? That question can change everything. What is this moment asking of me as a dad? And finally, remember that your family is learning how to interpret setbacks by watching you. If you are able to stay in sage, they're more likely to find their way there too. That's not theory. I watched it happen. And if this kind of thing hits close to home, if travel and family stress or those, hey, I'm just trying to hold it all together type moments, are where you feel most feel yourself getting tested as a dad. That's exactly the kind of real life leadership I help fathers work through with my coaching. Not just blowups, not just big crises, right? We've talked about this, but those subtle moments where pressure reveals who you are becoming. If you want support in that, I'd love to invite you to a complimentary coaching call. On that call, we can talk about things like where stress tends to show up most in your family, what kind of situations bring out your saboteurs, how you want to show up differently as a father and as a husband. And in full transparency, whether or not coaching with me and a group of other Christian dads would help grow in that steadiness. You can grab a time, for that through the link in the show notes. Your vacations are not going to be perfect, but they can still be meaningful. They can still be beautiful, and they can still form your family in powerful ways. So as you think about your own family experiences, whether at home or on the road, where do you most need to remember that a good decision can still lead to a hard outcome and still be the right decision? Hey, until next time, stay rooted in grace, stay steady in mind and spirit, and keep building your positive legacy one small intentional moment at a time. Talk again next week.